Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
When I left the Royal Huts Inn to visit the Devil's Punch Bowl and Gibbet Hill, I passed along a wide straight road, the new high road between London and Portsmouth, and shortly came to the edge of the Punch Bowl and easted my eyes on its beauty. The fog, which had been heavy in London when I left on this mid-October morning, hung in the valleys so that the tops of the Surrey hills rose like islands from the sea of mist. And in the brilliant sunshine which glorified these upper levels softened and mellowed all the wide expanse of hill and dale and down which ranged between me and the southern coast. The hill gave steeply on all sides save the northwest, where the circular valley opened to the plain below. All the summer tints were chastened and mellowed. All the full colors which the sunshine had glorified now faded into the sere of autumn. The pink and purple of the heather were changed to rich amber and faded yellow, and the grasses and wildflowers had donned their winter garb, the hues of decay. Through all these rich autumn tints, the bramble, untouched as yet by the frost, sent an emerald flash. The green bushes which fringed the tiny stream running through the valley seemed of supernatural vividness, and the dark green of the pines which covered the western slope seemed to assert the right of nature to maintain her own color despite all influences. Away to the north and west, past the spurs and shoulders of the hill, the woods and valleys, the copses and villages and hills and ridges ranged in endless succession, and it was after a long, long pause that I turned from drinking in the beauty of the scene, with my heart full of the power and majesty and purifying influence of nature's beauty. Here, said I to myself, at least the soul of man is elevated, and on this higher plane of nature's handiwork the evil of our hearts is lulled. As I turned, however, I started, for there beside me was a tombstone by the roadside, marking the spot where a century ago a poor man was murdered. But not only the stone was of interest, for there were 3 figures by it which would have arrested attention anywhere. They were only children. 2 were young girls about some 13 or 14 years. They stood on each side of the memorial, each with a slim brown hand resting on an elbow of the stone, looking at me gravely with long, dark, fathomless eyes. They were both very pretty, and their slim, girlish figures were draped in black of some shimmering material, with a wide belt round the waist and dark material wound around the head. The third of the group was a little boy of some 10 years old, with hair of spun gold, eyes like blue porcelain, and a winning smile on his rosy face. He wore a dark, blood-colored tunic. For a few seconds I stood looking at this group, they regarding me without the slightest movement. Then I spoke to them, making some remark about the beauty of the scene. One of the girls spoke, tapping the stone with her hand as she said, "Can you tell us anything about this stone, sir? We are strangers." "I am a stranger here myself," I answered, "but I think we will find it here." I proceeded to read aloud the inscription on both sides of the stone. When I read the word murder, they all 3 looked at each other, and then at me, and shuddered, and, strange to say, followed the shudder with a smile. I thought they might be frightened, and I hastened to add, "But you need not let that disturb you. It all happened 100 years ago, when the country was very different from what it is now." "I hope not," one of the girls said in a low voice. The little boy looked up at me with a laugh and said, "I suppose if there were a murder now, someone would be stuck up on Gibbet Hill." "You know all about it, I see," said I. "I'm going to the hilltop to see the memorial cross. Will you come?" "With pleasure," he said, lifting his cap in acknowledgement of my invitation. The girls bowed as well, and we all moved up the hill together. As we went, I noticed that the boy had one of his hands tightly clenched. "What have you got there?" I asked of him. He opened his hand and showed me a crumpled mass of earthworms, wiggling in their sudden freedom. "I love worms," he said. "Poor worms," said I. "Why not let them go? They would much rather be on the ground." "I shan't," was his only reply, as he shoved them back into the folds of his tunic. There were a lot of people at the cross when we reached the top of Gibbet Hill, beside abundant evidence of recent visitors in the shape of eggshells and newspapers, for the cross was a favorite picnicking spot. I soon became so absorbed by the lovely view which stretched before me, a wilderness of rising hilltops with green woods and rich valleys, that I quite forgot my young companions. I went to the edge of the steep hill and sat down looking eastwards, and lost myself in the beauty of the scene. Presently, I remembered my young companions and looked around for them, but they had quite disappeared. There was not a sight of them anywhere around. I took my way to a deep, shady grove of hazel and beech with tall pines rising over all, one of those dense copses that creep up from the valley, throwing jagged spikes of greenery up the slopes of the hill. My departure from London had been early, and the walk in the blazing October sun fatiguing, so after a while, when I had been all around the summit, I took my way to a deep shady grove of hazel and beech with tall pines rising over all, one of those dense copses that creep up from the valley, throwing jagged spikes of greenery up the slopes of the hill. The undergrowth grew luxuriously under the shelter of clustering pines. The brown of the bark and the bluish bloom of the foliage, the sweet, aromatic odor which they exhaled, the sleepy silence accentuated only by the hum of nature's vitalities, the soft, rich grass whose summer greenery stood untouched. Here was the very perfection of autumn fullness. With a blissful feeling of content, I stretched myself on the grass, and soon lost my thoughts and my consciousness in the interlacing branches above me. How long I slept, I know not, but it must have been a good while. There was, however, no press of coming work, which in such cases destroys the charm of awaking. I knew there was ample time before me, and that I could revel to my heart's content in the freshness and purity of this wonderful spot. And so I lay on my back, with my hands under my head, looking up into the branches and watching the gleams of light struggle through the tracery of leaves. There was in the air the same faint hum of varied sounds which had at first lulled me to sleep. But somehow the volume was richer than before, more full and satisfying to the ear, and with a special significance, as if all nature was speaking, but that there was one voice more potent than the rest. It was not as if it grew in loudness, but merely as if the vibrations accumulated, coming in waves more quickly than they could die away, and gradually I heard only this one sound. In general effect, it was like a sort of musical muffled bird call, a corncrake in a whisper, but with some subtle prevailing sweetness of almost irresistible attraction. I raised my head from the bracken where I lay and looked where the sound proceeded. There, to my surprise, were the children whom I had seen. The two girls were seated, and between them the little boy stood up. One of the girls held a set of pipes slightly thicker than wheaten straws. Across this, she drew something attached to the fingers of her right hand, which made the base of the strange sound. The other girl held a shell with strings across it, and the boy had a sort of reed flute which gave forth a long, sweet note which blended in the mass of music. By and by the girls stood up. They all turned slightly, and I could see that they were evidently turning slowly in a complete circle. As they began to face my direction, I sank down so that they might not see me, and a very short time elapsed before my attention was diverted. Hearing a stir among the dead leaves beside me, I looked around and almost jumped to my feet, for there, close by and approaching closer, was a large snake. It came straight towards me and actually passed over my feet. I did not stir, and it went on, heeding me no more than if I had been a log of wood, and wiggled away towards the group in the sunlit glade. It was evidently attracted by the music, and the snake approached closer and closer, till at the feet of the fair-haired child it stopped, and, curling itself into a spiral, raised its head and began to hiss. The boy looked down, and the girls turned their eyes toward him, but the music did not stop for a moment. It grew quicker. Then the snake twined itself around the child's ankle, and began to climb its way up his body, round and round his leg and thigh, and up, till at last it crawled along the arm that held the flute. Then, suddenly, the music stopped, and the boy stretched out his arm with the snake around it, with his hand open, palm upwards. The snake remained perfectly still, as if transformed into stone. Then the girls took hands and circled slowly around the boy, uttering a low, whispering, mysterious chant, something the same as the earlier one, but this time in a minor key. The boy remained perfectly still, with his arm extended and his blue eyes fixed on the snake. Then the latter raised its head slightly and seemed to follow the movements of the circling girls. They continued, round and round, the snake's movements more and more pronounced with each revolution, till it was boldly turning around the boy's arm. Gradually, the motion of the girls and the low crooning music died away altogether, and the snake hung as limp as a string across the boy's hand. The girls let go of each other's hands, and one of them, who had stopped just in front of the boy, took the snake by its head and tail and seemed to gently pull it out straight, and lay it across the boy's hand as stiff as a piece of wood. Then began some questioning between them in a language which I did not understand. Both voices were sweet, but one of them I seemed instinctively to fear, although it was the sweeter and softer of the two. Somehow, and the idea was quite spontaneous, it seemed to suggest murder. When each girl in turn had her say, and they suggested positive and negative in their tones, the snake would slowly turn around like the needle in a compass and point its head to either one. The sweeter voice seemed to be the positive, and the other the negative, which seemed to annoy the positive inquirer. And her voice grew more deadly sweet and penetrating until it made me shudder. Then she seemed to get more and more enraged, for her eyes gleamed with a dark, unholy light, and at last came her question in a keen, thrilling whisper. The snake spun round quicker and suddenly came to a dead stop in front of the other girl. The disappointed one gave a fierce, short, sharp sound like a dog's bark, while a look of deadly malice swept over her face. At the same instant, the snake collapsed and hung as limp as before, and then slipped to the ground and lay there without motion, as if dead. The boy began to laugh. The girls joined, and in an instant the glade, which had seemed so weird, grew with laughter, as the children chased each other into the wood and disappeared from view. I rose up from the bracken. I could hardly believe my eyes, and I thought that I must have been sleeping and dreamt it all. But the seemingly dead snake lay before me as palpable evidence that I had beheld reality. The sun was far in the west when I found myself once more at the highest point on Gibbet Hill. The place was now deserted. The picnickers had all gone home, the parties of school children had disappeared, and nothing remained of the day's visitation but the usual increase in old newspapers and broken eggshells. As the light was just beginning to fade and the air to grow a shade colder, the sense of loneliness was more than ever marked. But I had come from the midst of the hum and turmoil of the city to enjoy this very loneliness, and its luxury was to me unspeakable. Down in the valleys the mist lay dim and fleecy white, and from it the hilltops rose dark and grim. A belt of cloud fringed the whole horizon, and above it stretched a sea of sulphur yellow, flecked here and there with little clouds of white, which, swimming high above the level of the hill, caught the last splendors of the sun, now obscured by the horizon. 1 or 2 stars began to twinkle through the darkening sky, and a stillness that seemed sentient stole up through the valley and reached where I sat. Then the air grew colder, and the silence became perfect, and a soft light fell on the scene. I sat on and leaned with my back against the great stone cross, and putting my hands behind me, wrapped my arms around its back so as to drink in the wondrous beauty in which I was immersed. Suddenly, each hand was grasped from behind and held tight in a pair of hands, so strong I could make no movement, and a scarf of thick material was thrown over my face and drawn tightly from behind, holding my head close to the stone. My hands were tied around the wrists and drawn tight, and I took for granted that I was being prepared for robbery. I was alone, far away from everyone, and in the hands of men stronger than I was myself, secretly thankful that I had only a small sum of money with me. After a time which seemed long, but was probably a few minutes' duration, the scarf was pulled down so that my eyes were free, though my mouth was still covered and I was unable to cry out. There were the 3 children who had arrested my attention earlier in the day. They stood before me perfectly still and silent for a little while, their eyes being the only features which expressed consciousness or interest of any kind. The boy and 1 girl smiled on me with an amused superiority, while the other, who in the glade had exhibited such anger, smiled with a deadly cold hate which made me shudder. The latter then approached me closer, the others remaining still and looking on with their amused smile. She took from her waist, where it was concealed in the folds of her dress, a long, sharp dagger. She proceeded to flourish before me with extraordinary dexterity and rapidity. Its keen edge touched my skin, and the contact made me wince. Then she would dart towards my eyes till I could feel its cold point actually touching my eyeballs, and she would hurl herself at me with the point of the deadly weapon directed at my heart, but would stop just as it seemed that my last moment had come. I felt a cold chill, a strange numbness growing over me. My heart seemed to get cold and weak, colder and colder, weaker and weaker still, till at length my eyes closed. I tried to open them, succeeded, tried again, failed, succeeded, failed, and at length consciousness passed away from me. The last thing I remember seeing was the gleam of the long knife in the starlight. The last sound I heard was a low laugh from all 3 of the children. My consciousness struggled back into existence, and I opened my eyes. It was now much brighter, for a great yellow moon had arisen. A man was bending over me, shaking me roughly by the shoulder, while a lady stood by, looking on anxiously with her hands clasped. "He's not dead, George, is he?" I heard her say. "It is a mercy that you had the inspiration to come out and see the moonlight view, or he might have died of cold. He must have fallen asleep." "My heart," I murmured. "My heart," for it was icy cold. The past was coming back to me quickly now, and I asked him, "Did you see anywhere some children? 2 girls and a boy." "Yes, hours ago as they went down the road on a tricycle," the man said. "They were laughing, and we thought them the prettiest and happiest children we had ever seen." "But why?" "My heart," I cried out again, for there was a coldness which seemed to numb me. The man put his hand over my heart, but quickly tore it away with a cry of terror. "What is it, George? What is it?" shrieked the lady. He stood back, and she clung frightened to his arm, as a large worm wriggled itself out of my chest, fell on the ground, and glided down the hillside into the trees below.